Almost everyone who's ever held a fussy infant has caught themselves doing it without thinking, humming, rocking gently, singing something soft and repetitive with barely any real words at all, sometimes not even noticing they've started. Nobody formally teaches this. It just happens automatically, almost like flipping a switch the moment a crying baby ends up in someone's arms. And researchers studying this exact behavior across radically different human cultures have found something genuinely striking about just how deep and how old this specific instinct actually runs. Researchers use the term infant-directed song to describe this specific style of singing, and it turns out to be acoustically distinct from ordinary adult singing in remarkably consistent ways. Psychologist Sandra Trehub's extensive research found that infant-directed song reliably features a higher pitch, a noticeably slower tempo, and much more repetition than the same adult would typically use singing to another adult. This isn't a conscious performance choice most caregivers are deliberately making. It emerges automatically, shifting the moment an infant becomes the intended audience. Trehub and her colleagues ran studies specifically testing whether this pattern holds up across cultures with no meaningful musical overlap or shared exposure. Adult listeners from one culture, given short clips of infant-directed songs recorded in a completely unfamiliar culture, could reliably identify which recordings were meant for soothing a baby, purely from the acoustic pattern itself, at rates well above what random chance would predict. That's a genuinely strong piece of evidence that something close to a real human universal is operating here, not simply a locally learned cultural tradition passed down through specific lyrics or melodies. The specific experimental design behind this finding is worth walking through because it rules out a fairly obvious alternative explanation. Researchers made sure listeners had no prior exposure whatsoever to the specific culture's musical style being tested, and played only short audio clips stripped of any obvious contextual clues, no visible instruments, no recognizable language, nothing beyond the raw acoustic pattern of the voice itself. Even under these tightly controlled conditions, listeners consistently sorted infant-directed recordings correctly far more often than a random guess would predict, suggesting something in the sound itself, not shared cultural knowledge, was doing the actual work. This particular singing style does something measurable inside an infant's body, not just something that sounds nice from the outside. Research comparing infant-directed singing to infant-directed speech has found singing specifically associated with measurably lower cortisol levels in infants, the body's primary stress hormone, along with longer sustained periods of calm attention compared to speech alone under otherwise similar conditions. In other words, this isn't simply a pleasant background sound. It's producing a real, physiologically measurable calming effect happening directly inside the infant's own body. Picture a fussy, overtired infant in the middle of a stressful moment, cortisol elevated, attention scattered, difficult to settle through ordinary speech alone no matter how calm and reassuring the caregiver's tone happens to be. The moment infant-directed singing specifically begins, that same infant tends to settle measurably faster, holding calm, focused attention on the caregiver's face for a noticeably longer stretch than equivalent spoken reassurance alone tends to produce under otherwise comparable circumstances. It's a small, everyday moment that quietly repeats itself constantly across virtually every human household, in every culture, almost entirely, without anyone involved ever thinking twice about why it actually works this reliably. Interestingly, this calming effect doesn't run in only one direction between caregiver and infant. Research examining new mothers specifically has found that singing to an infant is also associated with reduced stress markers in the caregiver themselves, not just the baby being sung to. That points towards something considerably more reciprocal than a simple one-way soothing tool deployed purely for the infant's benefit. It looks more like a shared regulatory system, calming both people simultaneously through the exact same brief, repetitive act. One evolutionary explanation, associated with researcher Dean Falk, centers on a genuinely distinctive feature of human infant care compared to nearly every other primate species alive today. Human infants are unusually helpless at birth, unable to grip, cling, or move independently in any meaningful way, and human mothers, unlike most other primate mothers, frequently need to put their infant down entirely in order to gather food, use their hands for necessary tasks, or move efficiently through their environment while carrying other burdens. Falk's hypothesis suggests that vocal soothing may have evolved specifically as a substitute for constant physical contact, allowing an infant to feel a caregiver's continued presence and reassurance even while briefly separated by physical distance, rather than direct touch. This idea gains real support from a direct comparison with other primates and how they actually manage infant care physically. Most other primate infants cling directly and continuously to their mother's fur for extended stretches of time, maintaining constant physical contact throughout most of their early development without much need for a separate long-distance reassurance system operating independently of touch. Once human ancestors lost most of their body hair, an infant no longer had the same secure surface available to cling to independently, while a mother's hands were occupied elsewhere. Human infants also became increasingly helpless compared to other primate infants at a comparable developmental stage, unable to support their own weight or hold on securely even briefly. A vocal substitute for constant physical touch would have filled a genuinely new gap this specific combination of changes had opened up, one that simply didn't exist for furrier, more physically capable primate infants. Beyond simple soothing, researchers have found that singing to infants also supports broader early social development between caregiver and child, extending well past a purely calming function alone. Studies observing these interactions have documented increased mutual eye contact, more turn-taking style vocal exchanges, and generally stronger caregiver-infant attunement during and immediately following singing, compared to more neutral caregiving moments without any singing involved at all. This suggests infant-directed song isn't purely functioning as a calming mechanism on its own. It may also be actively laying down some of the earliest groundwork for social bonding and communication more broadly, well before an infant could ever produce a recognizable word of their own. It's worth being fair about the limits of how universal this behavior actually is when you look closely at its specific details rather than just the broad pattern. While the broad acoustic pattern shows up remarkably consistently across cultures, the exact melodies, specific lyrics, and how central lullabies are considered within a given culture's broader musical tradition varies quite a bit from place to place, sometimes considerably. Falk's specific evolutionary hypothesis about vocal soothing replacing physical contact is also just one proposed explanation among several genuinely competing theories researchers have offered for why human musicality evolved in the first place, and the topic remains an active, unsettled area of ongoing research within evolutionary musicology, without full consensus reached yet. Understood this way, that soft, repetitive hum you catch yourself producing around a fussy infant, without any formal training, and often without even fully noticing you're doing it, may be tapping into something considerably older than any specific lullaby or nursery rhyme you happen to know the words to, older than any language, older than any specific cultural musical tradition. It's less a learned skill in the traditional sense, and more like a very old, very specific setting your voice was apparently built with, quietly waiting in the background for exactly the right moment to switch itself on, without ever needing to be asked or taught. The next time you catch yourself humming to a baby without ever deciding to, without any conscious planning behind it at all, you're likely running a genuinely ancient piece of caregiving software, one that may be considerably older than language itself, and possibly older than any recognizable form of music too. That's exactly the kind of hidden thread this channel exists to dig up. If you want more of these, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.